Fred hated the Japanese so much that he would never let rice touch his lips again. That sentence describes how some prisoners of war couldn't forget World War II. It's from a good book, but the book wasn't a bestseller. Here's what Fred's aversion to rice looks like in a best-selling book.
From across the room, they looked like three ordinary men. As the men leaned together for photographs, all that they had been through seemed forgotten. Sometime amid the laughing and conversation, a waiter set a plate in front of Fred. On it, beside the entree, was a serving of white rice. That was all it took. Fred was suddenly raving, furious, hysterical, berating the waiter and shouting with such force that his face turned purple. Louis tried to calm him, but Fred was beyond consolation. He had come completely undone. The waiter hurried the rice away and Fred pulled himself together. But the spell was broken. For these men, nothing was ever going to be the same.
Wow, I feel for Fred. More than that, I won't judge a traumatized person if they behave similarly. Now let's look at some books on Nelson Mandela. How did South Africa's first president feel when he was imprisoned? At first, the prisoners and their lawyers expected that they would serve 10 years at the most. The book wasn't a bestseller. And how was this written in Mandela's best-selling autobiography?
And Lieutenant Van Wyck was perched in the back with us. He was a pleasant fellow, and during a lull in the singing, he offered his unsolicited opinion on our future. "Well," he said, "you chaps won't be in prison long. The demand for your release is too strong. In a year or two, you will get out and you will return as national heroes. Crowds will cheer you, everyone will want to be your friend, women will want you. Ag, you fellows have it made." We listened without comment, but I confess his speech cheered me considerably. Unfortunately, his prediction turned out to be off by nearly 3 decades.
Two biographies on the same person. The authors have access to the same information, but only one of them is a bestseller. Why? In both cases, the bestseller tells a vivid story. We experience the scenes. We're in the restaurant with Fred. We're in Mandela's brain. We know why he had his hopes up. How can you tell a vivid story? First, replace the abstract with the concrete. Devil at My Heels is the autobiography of Louis Zamperini. He's a US airman that was tortured by the Japanese, but he eventually forgave his captors. Initially, the Japanese treated him kindly. Let's hear him describe it. On Watcher, Phil and I were treated well by a kindly Japanese doctor and got food and water, which we managed to keep down by eating carefully. A few years later, Laura Hillenbrand interviewed Louis. She rewrote the book and it became a bestseller.
On the doctor's orders, in came a bottle of Russian cognac and 2 glasses, which Louis and Phil quickly emptied. Then came a platter of eggs, ham, milk, fresh bread, fruit salad, and cigarettes. The castaways dug in.
Notice how food is replaced with 5 concrete items? We can see all these items. It helps us understand how kind the doctor was. But Louis was soon shipped to another island, and he was treated much worse there. Here's his account. The guards shoved food through an 8-inch slot in the cell's solid wood door. Appetizing it was not. I got whatever was left over from the men's mess. Fish heads, boiled daikon, not otherwise fed to the pigs. Sometimes they'd reach into the slot bucket, squeeze together a gob of rice the size of a golf ball, and throw it at me. That usually meant an hour or 2 spent crawling around in the half-light, on the dirty floor, trying to find every grain while the guards howled with delight. Even then, I'd have to spit out sand. That's terrible. 2 ways to degrade someone. Now let's hear Laura's rewriting.
When the guards weren't venting their fury at the captives, they entertained themselves by humiliating them. Every day, at gunpoint, Louis was forced to stand up and dance, staggering through the Charleston, while his guards roared with laughter. The guards made Louis whistle and sing, pelted him with fistfuls of gravel, taunted him as he crawled around his cell to pick up bits of rice, and slid long sticks through the door window so they could stab and swat him, finding his helpless contortions hilarious. Once, driven to his breaking point by a guard jabbing him, Louis yanked the stick from the guard's hands. He knew he might get killed for it, but under this unceasing degradation something was happening to him. His will to live, resilient through all the trials on the raft, was beginning to fray.
The passage describes 7 humiliating actions, and they are all face-to-face actions. They seem much more intensely degrading than in Louis' account. There's physical pain. It's clear Louis is being pushed to the brink as he does something that can get him killed. Thus, Laura's book tugs at my heartstrings more. Torture is bad, but throwing rocks is much worse than throwing rice. Laura's description highlights the second technique of bestsellers. They use the most powerful examples, and as many of them as possible. It's as if Laura combed through Louis' memory and got everything out. She then asks herself, of these actions, which are the most humiliating? Powerful details make you want to continue to turn pages. Third, Laura explains why these events were so important.
The guards sought to deprive them of something that had sustained them, even as all else had been lost: dignity. This self-respect and sense of self-worth, the innermost armament of the soul, lies at the heart of humanness. To be deprived of it is to be dehumanized, to be cleaved from and cast below mankind. Men subjected to dehumanizing treatment experience profound wretchedness and loneliness, and find that hope is almost impossible to retain. Without dignity, identity is erased. In its absence, men are defined not by themselves, but by their captors and the circumstances in which they are forced to live. One American airman, shot down and relentlessly debased by his Japanese captors, described the state of mind that his captivity created. I was literally becoming a lesser human being.
In explaining the importance of these events, Laura uses a whole range of emotions. More importantly, we are told that these emotions are essential to humanness. Can any human being suffer more degrading treatment? The passage helped me see things through Louis' eyes. I myself became emotional, and I suspect many other readers were also touched by this passage. In fact, the most highlighted sentences in the book are these sentences. They are impactful and memorable. Passages like this help explain why Laura's book sold well. In fact, it was the #1 bestseller on the New York Times list for 14 weeks. Compare this to Louis' explanation. My new life was no new life at all. Better to starve me or send me out to sea again on the raft. At least dying that way would allow me some dignity. We are told that Louis lost his dignity and that he didn't feel like living. But Louis' explanation doesn't have many things that Laura's has. What emotions is Louis feeling? Why exactly does Louis want to die? What exactly did the Japanese take away from Louis? Notice that Laura's book shows and tells. It shows us what happened to Louis, and it explains in detail how Louis was affected, which reinforces the story's theme. We understand and remember the story better. Also, Louis writes as if he has already lost the battle. Laura writes as if Louis is still fighting the battle. We want to know the outcome, so we are more motivated to continue reading Laura's book. Fourth, bestsellers focus much more on the main story than other books. That is, they focus more on the strong feelings and main goals of the main characters. Let's continue with Louis' story. After the war, Louis sought revenge on his most vicious captor, a Japanese soldier called the Bird. The bird had often knocked Louis unconscious, and that was only the tip of the iceberg. Let's hear Louis describe his feelings. I had achieved many goals, and now only one remained: to make as much money as I possibly could and use some of it to return to Japan and find the bird and give him the deadly payback he deserved. Now let's turn to Laura's bestseller.
Murdering the bird had become his secret, fevered obsession, and he had given his life over to it. In a gym near his apartment, he spent hours slamming his hatred into a punching bag, preparing his body for the confrontation that he believed would save him. He walked around every day with murder in his head.
Louis says that he had only one goal left, but how much time did he spend on it? Laura makes it clear, hours and every day. And she gave imagery to the intangible, a punching bag, a confrontation, and murder. Her writing makes the stakes clear. Louis will get the bird at all costs. It makes me want to read on. I'm genuinely curious. Will Louis kill the bird? Both books then describe events in Louis' life. For example, here's how Louis describes a failed business venture. When my partner drove to Mexico to get the necessary signatures to seal the deal, he died in a head-on collision with a Mack truck. Poof! No more deal. But only Laura's book links this back to Louis' mission.
Each time Louis got some money together, it was lost in another failed venture, and his return to Japan had to be put off still longer.
And Louis also writes about lots of events that were unrelated to his hatred of the bird. Here's an example. After we left St. Louis, I had my own run-in with the flight attendant. I don't know why, but the number 3 motor on the Constellation sometimes leaked oil and caught fire. I looked out the window and spotted oil trailing. I told Frank Sinatra, who was sitting next to me, and called the attendant, and she brought me up for getting the passengers aroused. I didn't care. "Young lady," I said, "you'd better call the captain right now." "Sir, you're disturbing the passengers." I said, "You'd better get the captain, or I'll get him." This time he came to see me. When I pointed out the problem, he ran like mad back to the cockpit, turned the ship around, and flew back to St. Louis. It's good to know that Louis saved the day, and that he sat next to a famous singer. But it's unrelated to his hatred of the bird. So Laura's book generally omits events like this. The stakes in Laura's book start high and remain high. It's hard to put down Laura's book. Louis eventually forgave the bird. Here's his account. "I just wanted to look the bird in the eyes, put my arm around him, and say, 'I forgive you.' Yet even in apparent death, as he had in life, the bird still managed to confound me." Now, here's Laura's account.
He felt something that he had never felt for his captor before. With a shiver of amazement, he realized that it was compassion. At that moment, something shifted sweetly inside him. It was forgiveness, beautiful and effortless and complete. For Louis Zamperini, the war was over.
Hearing the depths of Louis' hatred makes his forgiveness seem remarkable. The contrast is stunning, and Laura's 4-sentence account neatly illustrates 4 concepts mentioned earlier. There's a vivid story. There are concrete details. It tells us the significance of Louis' forgiveness, and it focuses only on forgiveness, because that's the central theme of the story. Louis' forgiveness gave me a sense of awe as I finished the book. And that's the 5th technique of telling a vivid story. End by leaving the reader awestruck. One way to create a sense of awe is to describe highly important changes. Louis' forgiveness is one example. Another example is Nelson Mandela's best-selling autobiography. Mandela became South Africa's first black president in 1994. Here's how he described his inauguration.
On the day of the inauguration, I was overwhelmed with a sense of history. In the first decade of the 20th century, a few years after the bitter Anglo-Boer War and before my own birth, the white-skinned peoples of South Africa patched up their differences and erected a system of racial domination against the dark-skinned peoples of their own land. The structure they created formed the basis of one of the harshest, most inhumane societies the world has ever known. Now, in the last decade of the 20th century, and my own 8th decade as a man, that system had been overturned forever and replaced by one that recognized the rights and freedoms of all peoples, regardless of the color of their skin.
We close the book with Mandela's importance fresh in our minds. Contrast this with Mandela's authorized biography. How lasting and deep is Mandela's achievement behind his dazzling image? A contemporary biographer cannot hope to provide a definitive historical judgment. We only get the idea that there are conflicting views of Mandela's achievement, and that's the passage which comes closest to evaluating Mandela's legacy. So it's not surprising that the book didn't sell as well. Another way to create a sense of awe: highlight the difficulties the main characters face. In 1944, 19-year-old Rudolf Verba escaped Auschwitz. He and his friend warned the world about the Nazi death camp. After a long struggle, Hungary stopped deporting some Jews to Auschwitz. Let's hear a bestseller describe Verba's achievement.
The Jews of the capital city were saved for now. There were many explanations, starting with the shifting calculus of Hungarian politics as Germany began to look like the losing side in the war. But a crucial role was played by a 32-page document written by two men, one of them a teenager, who had done what no Jews had ever done before and escaped from Auschwitz. They had crossed mountains and rivers. They had hidden and starved. They had defied death and the most vicious enemy the world had ever seen. Their word had been doubted, it had been ignored, and it had been suppressed. But now, at last, it had made the breakthrough they had longed for. Rudolf Verba and Fred Wetzler had saved 200,000 lives.
This helps me remember the story, and it makes me want to share it. Contrast this with Verba's own account. The world knew at last about Auschwitz. My escape, in fact, had not been in vain. Horthy stopped the deportations, and of the 1 million earmarked for the gas chambers, only 400,000 had died. We are not reminded of the challenges Verba faced, so we are less awestruck, even though Verba claimed to have saved 600,000 lives. In short, bestsellers use strong imagery for important events. They do so using the most powerful concrete details. If an event is part of the story's backbone, the bestseller will also explain its significance, using the most powerful details. But when an event is unimportant to the plot, it would be omitted or described only briefly. And bestsellers end by giving the readers a sense of awe. Here's a checklist you can use for your own writing. If you've enjoyed this video, please comment with a happy face emoji below. It would make my day.